you for hosting, and thank you for the very kind words about me in particular, but I think also 80,000 hours. And also for the little tip that I should make sure that people have context and know a little bit about who I am and what 80,000 hours is. So as you said, I'm an advisor. I think giving advice is kind of perilous business because we all have such limited experience, and people are so diverse in their backgrounds and what they want to do and how they think about things. And I do think that this, is that this is a little bit of what the value proposition for what I do, which is one-on-one advising at 80,000 hours, because 80,000 hours as a whole has a number of different products. We're principally a website that writes up articles on how you can use your career to do good. We also have a podcast, same theme, except it's very focused on talking to experts and going deep on what they're experts in. And then we have a job board where we kind of say hey, here are the roles that we think really ought to be filled. And we put them out there for our readers and our users to consider filling or applying for. So it's a lot of different messages to a lot of different audiences of different sizes. And yeah, I think that's an additional kind of level of perilousness because everyone's, as I said, background, ways of thinking, goals can be quite different. And there's no good one size fits all message. But as a small nonprofit organization, we give off some kind of vibe that people take away and say oh, that's what 80,000 hours thinks I should do. And I can say that as a fan of our products from before I worked here, especially the podcast, a lot of people think man, those conversations I hear on the 80,000 hours podcast, those are so cool. I should do whatever the 80,000 hours people think I should do. And there's just not a truth of the matter about what we think you as an individual person should do. So I don't want people to take away that message. So those are there's some big important kind of caveats. And with those caveats, I'm gonna plow through what I see as the broad 80,000 hours philosophy about how you should be thinking about your career and approaching it, and kind of the exercises you should do and places you should check in with yourself and do that. And hopefully I'll do this pretty quickly so that we can dive into Q&A and open conversation about all the nooks and crannies that you think are relevant there. So with no further ado, I think everyone can see my slides. I'm sharing my screen. Get some thumbs up. Great. So yeah, this is my 80K career planning talk from me, Matt Reardon. And are my arrow keys or space bar working? No. Oh, there we are. My clicker is working. Excellent. Okay, so in a nutshell, the 80,000 hours approach, I think of it as 4 steps. Step number 1 is clarify your values. Step number 2 is pick a problem. Step number 3 is target a role. This can be relatively abstract. And then step number 4 is work backwards. So I guess when I say work backwards, the role you're targeting is probably your peak role. So most people, I think in careers generally, whatever you're trying to do in the world, kind of have their peak output, earnings, influence, whatever you want to call it, kind of mid-career. So from the time, broadly speaking, 35 to 55 or 60. And I guess for many of our users, though not all, they are a bit before this time, though some of them are close to that time. And that's one place where answers are going to diverge. But yeah, see where you could kind of potentially peak and where you think most of the value in your career is going to lie, and try to work backwards from there because the answers to these questions might be different depending on what step you're at. And might not all look the same at each step. And then the little caveat that I kind of add to this is that I think to the extent that people have a cached view of what career advising is or should look like, for just general folks out there, which are probably more focused on income and day-to-day happiness than the 80,000 hours approach is very focused on social impact. They probably spend too little time getting real clarity on what their values are and what they imply about what they should do. And yeah, if you're not focused on social impact, you're probably not picking a problem because the problem is something just much more immediately obvious or apparent to you as a personal matter. So I think if you want to have social impact, the things that you might neglect just thinking about careers the way that anyone thinks about their career are these first 2. And so I put a little extra emphasis on them. And with that, I can dive into step 1, clarifying values, and some ways to think about that. I'm using my clicker. Great. Yeah. And then tips for the whole exercise. I forgot I had this slide. Tip number 1 is actually do it. Yeah, I guess to my shame, I'm probably only halfway through this process, despite the fact that I work here and advocate for it. And I think that's also true of a lot of people who work here. It is hard to spend the number of hours that I indicate on the slide, actually sitting down, thinking, writing about the stuff, having conversations about it. So yeah, I do just think that people need an extra push to be yeah, this isn't going to happen automatically just because you think it's a good idea and you heard it one day. You do need to like put yourself and get some systems in place to actually like make it happen, put things on your calendar, get someone to hold you accountable, etc. And then like put in the actual time to know that you did it sufficiently thoroughly. This is where I can say for people who are less familiar with 80,000 hours and its marketing, our name 80,000 hours comes from the number of hours in your career. If you work 2,000 hours a year for 40 years, we can approximate that as the length of a career, or how much time you really spend at work. And the claim is like, well, if that's how much time you're going to spend at work, you should probably invest some reasonable fraction of that, really like creating a plan that you have buy-in on for how you're going to use all those hours. And yeah, I think 150 to 300 hours is very reasonable in light of 80,000. Yeah, so it could be more, but it's yeah, I guess like doing a whole lot less than that, which is what I think most people do, I think is a mistake. Great, and then this process is going to come up with lots of questions, and then like, yeah, being able to use that time means taking them seriously enough that you're treating them like research questions and really digging into like multiple perspectives on like how these things can resolve questions in your career. Yeah, so now we're on to step one, clarifying values. And I think like, yeah, there's a lot of intersection, you know, because I guess the other aspect of 80,000 hours, right, is that's just a big portion of your life overall. It's not like you can totally divorce your career where you're spending, I don't know, maybe half your waking hours from your life and who you are and what really matters to you. So it is going to be like personal, and to the extent that you want to have social impact, it's going to be like this very moral kind of exploration. So yeah, I'll say like fundamental thing number one is like, what does morality mean to you? What does doing good mean to you? How much do these things trade off against each other? I know lots of people who've just made enormous sacrifices. I'm not one of them. I feel like I've made pretty modest sacrifices in my life to be a better person and do more good. But one of the first kind of like, you know, hurdles that you run into when you think about what I want to do with my career is like, yeah, how do my, you know, selfish objectives and my non-selfish objectives trade off against each other? And I think everyone reaches a different answer along a very broad continuum. Yeah, but just figuring out, or at least acknowledging and recognizing there's a continuum here along which you can fall, and thinking about where you want to fall and what the consequences of that are, I think are super valuable. And then I have my little bullets. I guess the 80,000 hours claim is like, yeah, again, the standard kind of view of careers is a more selfish one, because we're a selfish species, we live in a selfish world. People want to like, you know, have fun. And I think fundamentally that's deeply true. There's just like ways that we can help other people have fun that have much higher returns than just like getting ourselves to have fun. And that's the 80,000 hours claim. And so like one way to frame it is that like personal things just vary a lot from person to person, and then for individual people over time in ways that are hard to predict. Whereas like moral philosophy, which is a field that has existed for a long time, can, in theory at least, give you kind of like robust conclusions, kind of fixed North Stars that you can hold up and say like, well, my personal tastes and ideas about what's a good time for me, you know, may vary and have varied over time. But like, I don't know, I actually spent a lot of time and realized that I believe these things about the broader world outside. And like, yeah, maybe if I'm going to pursue something reliable, that is a big part of that reliable thing that I could pursue. And then I have my snarky self quote about like, yeah, the world's problems aren't going to fix themselves. There's hope for you to fix yourself. And yeah, just, oh, this is a famous 80K cartoon that we had. I do get the sense that, yeah, for most people, like passions are fleeting. Ice cream when you're a child, yeah, might be a really, really big, exciting deal to you. But now I think most of us are hopefully beyond that stage and realize that if we had just like doggedly pursued that quote unquote passion, you know, we might regret the decision as the character in the cartoon does here. I do think this is not true for literally everyone. I think some people very early in life hit on something that just really arrests them in just like a way that they cannot stop thinking about this particular problem. And in my advising, when I run across such people, I generally tell them like, no, don't change. I'm glad you like our content and our ideas about what's important to solve, but like, you know, what the world really needs is for people to be doing the thing that they're best at and pursuing their comparative advantage. And for some people, that just like, yeah, is just like, it really smacks them in the face. It's really like quite obvious. Though I feel for the vast majority of people, including myself and most people I speak to, we don't have something pulling on us that hard. and being a little more speculative, I don't think anyone really arrives at something that pulls on them that quite as hard as it does like people you see in the media, for example. I don't know. I just listened to I just listened to a podcast with like Mr. Beast. I don't know if any of you know who Mr. Beast is, but he's like the most popular YouTuber ever, I guess. And he's like, I don't know, on track to be a billionaire or something. Just he gets so many views for all his videos. It's like just as a media person, and he's like 24. He's like a guy from Texas. But I listened to him talk about his life for 2 hours, and he's just like content, views, entertainment, engagement. He's like, I eat it and breathe it, and it's like, wow, okay, that guy should make YouTube videos, like just silly, stupid, entertaining ones that I don't think have more redeeming value beyond that. Yeah, and that's what I would tell him to do. But again, I think there's a reason that he's on a very popular podcast I was listening to him on. Is because he's this really exceptional character, and he's not like most of us. And most of us should be more open, look for that kind of like moral North Star. Cool. So yeah, just another little riff on this, like clarifying your values is the moral component, which, if you believe my claim about it being this robust thing you can pursue, here are like some questions that you can ask. What ultimately matters? I ask this question when I talk to folks, what's terminally valuable? Well, if you think such and such action is like a moral action, well, why is that? And okay, and then why is that? And why is that? Until you get to something where it's like, no, this is just obvious to me that it is the thing that matters. And like some, things for this are welfare, just like the idea of well-being, the subjective experience of some being that I care about. Justice, the idea of like some essential fairness or equality. It doesn't like particularly matter, how well off these beings are, as long as there's like some notion of equality or equal treatment or fairness between them. And it's just like, it's kind of pulls your moral strings in a way where you say like, it needs no further justification, the thing speaks for itself or something like that. So those are just some examples of things you might explore in this 50 to 100 hour portion of step 1 of your career exploration, right? And then I said again, like, who are your patients? What beings matter? Are they people? Are they animals? Are they people now? Are they future people, future animals, non-animal entities? And yeah, again, just getting back to this cruxy question is like, how much do you care? Because in some ways you can back up and say like, how selfish do I want to be? It might depend on like how much really sitting with and thinking about the experience of these beings and people who are not me. How much does that affect how much I really want to be selfish? Because then these can coalesce in a nice way. So I think as long as you're in this stage of clarifying your values, you can kind of spend time with both. And so I do challenge people to just think a lot about like the decisions I make, the things I'm pulled towards. Why am I pulled towards them? Great. That leads us to step 2, which is pick a problem. And I guess my claim here is that like, yeah, as much as people often talk about generalists kind of taking over the world and generalists being important and things like that, I think most people we classify as generalists were specialists at one point. Elon Musk was like an engineer, a mechanical engineer. He like built stuff. I don't know if he was like particularly good at that. I understand he's been very good at hiring people to do that for him. But he sort of like, on some minor level, made a name for himself in the kind of engineering community. And that gave him a platform and some credibility to then like get the kind of buy-in from people that you need to like run the big businesses that he runs. And it's interesting, whatever your perspectives might be, that like Twitter, which is a much more kind of social thing, is working out less well for him than these like more SpaceX, Tesla kind of like concrete engineering things. And that's like pure speculation on my part. But it's one example of how like I'm skeptical of the idea of a true generalist. Even people in kind of more social science, humanities kind of arenas kind of have specialties. They know about certain aspects of history or certain aspects of the economy. And that's kind of like their ticket to bigger conversations where they then, can build teams and become people who look more like generalists in the world. And I guess like, yeah, entrepreneurs and management people and team builders, right? Some of them actually just like focus on that. But that's a kind of specialty in and of itself. So I do think that like deep expertise on something is both like an early ticket to success and can just be like the whole story. And in the frame of like picking a problem, I think like you can be an expert on like some problem, probably a relatively weird problem or a relatively small or weird aspect of a bigger problem. Yeah, to the extent that like it does just like get you those tickets to conversations, and those conversations are leverage and impact. So I think there is just a lot of just general reasons to think there's big returns to specializing and to picking a particular thing that you want to go quite deep on. yeah, and what should that particular thing be, I think is going to be decided by these three factors, namely like figuring out like, yeah, what your values imply, that thing you just spent all that other time on, about the thing you should do in the world. And then like how you think the world works. What are the cause and effect kind of chains that lead things to happen in the world? And then noticing where the world is out of sync. As I said, work on neglected things, work on slightly weird things, right? Because there are small ponds in which you can be a big fish. And that is just like one opportunity to do a lot more good. And oftentimes, I think careful reflection on values, not a lot of people are doing. So there's a lot of intersection between neglected things and things that matter a lot in the world, or at least that's the claim that I believe, and I think is part of the standard kind of 80,000 hours model, but your exercise may yield different results. Cool. And yeah, as far as that like first part of the trident goes, I think Doing Good Better is like this kind of seminal effective altruism text a lot of you have run across, and it focuses on importance and scale, probably from a welfarist perspective, though I think like, yeah, it makes room for like other perspectives to be worked into this like importance, this scale consideration. And then tractability is probably what most of this pick a problem thing is about. Just in the sense that like, you want to know what works and have a model of the world. And I do think depending on how big the problem you're trying to solve is, things can be more or less tractable. But what you kind of want to do is think through a number of different approaches you could have and kind of eliminate the bad ones. And even if the best one is still like not a surefire like win, it's the best of the things that you could think of after you spend a lot of time with it. So it's worth digging further on. And maybe it ends up failing and you have to like come back to this step. But I think that's true of all the steps in the process. And then neglectedness is this thing that is gonna feature throughout. Yeah, I think the hardest part of what 80,000 hours does and what I do is syncing up with people about what we think like cause and effect in the world are like, and like making predictions about what will work and where the world is going. And so here I just like share this graph that is like pretty popular in 80,000 hours circles. We're like, all right, whatever your world model is, we realize this is a really hard problem and people disagree about it in all kinds of different directions. It should probably incorporate this idea that like, this is GDP here, but like it could also be population. It could be like lots of things. It's like something very, very strange for our species happened in the last 200 years, where like the lives that we live are just like very, very different from the lives of like the vast majority, pretty much all humans before, 250 or 300 years ago. And we're really in different territory now. And it's not the territory that we like evolved to live in. And I think that's actually where like a lot of, where you can find a lot of neglectedness and a lot of like potential for change is that like, we have the brains that we evolved to have for the environment that we evolved in. And like, it causes people to make mistakes. And I think this like selfishness is like one of those mistakes. But like, there are lots of other kind of mistakes. I think a lot of like myopia and tribalism is like one of those things. Like people just like get much too invested in the groups they feel identities with, and kind of take it to extremes when they come into conflicts with other groups. I don't know what that implies about like the problems that I think about. Maybe it's just another reason why I think some of the things that I think about are neglected. And I don't know. So just to take an example to make it a little more concrete, I think about like COVID and the September 11th attacks. And I just like, think about these two things and think about how many people died in one versus the other. I think everyone here will agree, like just COVID was just like a vastly bigger problem. But we're here like still in COVID to some degree and only like maybe 2 or 3 years away from like our peak level of like social concern about it. And it's just like very, very different than the world and the reaction and the amount of resources and attention that were given to terrorism, 2 or 3 years after 9/11, in the opposite direction of what the size of these events would imply. And I think that's because like 9/11, invoked a lot of this tribal stuff about like, well, we're Americans and like the people who attacked us are not Americans and this is a huge deal. And our, to some degree, like our pride, our honor, our identities, our egos are all under attack. And therefore, like we need to drop everything and totally change the way that we live our lives in our society to like respond to this. Even though on a lives saved, deaths averted kind of analysis about like how big of a problem this is, it pales in comparison to COVID, which now my read of the political situation is something we're largely trying to sweep under the rug. And people kind of don't want to think about it and they're like kind of happy to ignore it and they're not like fired up about how do we fight this thing and how do we fight the next one. So I don't know, that's just like a story that Matt tells because Matt believes some things about the world that illustrates this idea like about like, people out there just don't have intuitions that fit this world that we're in now. And that's like a potential way for you to find interesting problems and interesting solutions. Cool. And then, yeah, I have more examples on a controversial slide of like small problems we really, really emphasize. You know, and there's people on both sides of, I think, pretty much all of these. I don't really understand the social media thing. There's people on maybe many, many sides of that. But, you know, there are people who are like really, really excited about guns and they want more guns and they want more easy access to more kinds of guns. And lots of people who feel probably in this chat like the opposite. And then, yeah, again, like there's people who want to fight the war on drugs really hard. They're against like cartels and gangs. And there are other people who want to end the war on drugs because of all the, you know, deleterious effects it has on many people's lives, you know, here in America and elsewhere in the world. And you could just imagine a different way of approaching, you know, the problem or market for those products in a way that doesn't cause all these negative consequences. But I just kind of like go down to list 2 here and compare those to like malaria, where like more than 500,000 people are still dying of this one disease, and there are many diseases kind of like in this band that are like relatively easy to treat, and it like never makes the news, doesn't get a big part of the budget. It's like not something people are thinking about. And then, you know, if you've been to other effective altruism meetings, I'm sure you're thinking about animal welfare to a large degree as well. You think about chicken farming and just the like tens, maybe hundreds of billions over spans of time of chickens that live through what chickens live through. And again, like just not very much resources or attention on that sort of problem, despite the enormous numbers. And pandemics, I already talked about a bit, but it's like another thing. So I think this is just like setting the scene for being like, well, picking your problem really matters, because like maybe some of those problems are on top are like really exciting because they're in the news and you can like talk about them at sort of like neutral family gatherings or something like that. And it makes you seem interesting and exciting. And like, it's good to be interesting and exciting and to have good things to say at family gatherings and such. But like, when you think about your life and your career and what morality means, like maybe there's like something bigger or more deep or more meaningful that matters more for the world than those things that are popular. Cool. And yeah, so this is like a slide that is just like something you got to take home to like do this exercise yourself. And I really do endorse making lists. Just try to rank the problems in the world yourself. Do some independent thinking about that. Rank them and then ask these questions about them and think, what more can I learn? What can I do? Have some conversations with some friends, really like attack your list and then alter it, move things up and down. And hopefully at the end of that process, and again, it's like, you know, 10 to 50 hour kind of process you can do just the list part, maybe even less than 10. Yeah, I think at the end of that process, you feel better about your list and you feel like you probably learned a few things about the world and have some more confidence in the problem that you most specifically want to attack. Cool. And then once you've chosen your problem, you can target a role and think about, okay, what would a solution to the problem look like? And I say even be like impossible, tautological. It's like if you're worried about pandemics, you just need like perfect detection all the time. The first time something that looks like a pandemic is getting started anywhere in the world, and you can instantly respond to it. Like, seems unrealistic. The world is like big and messy, and it's like hard to do that. But like, you can probably move in that direction. And crucially for the second part, you can think about which actors in the world have the power to get you something like that, or something that does move in that direction. And then like name those actors. And those actors can be like silly levels of, you know, influential, wealthy, powerful, prestigious, like the president. The president could do something about this. Yeah, and does that mean that you should aim to be the president? Probably not. But like, because the president can do something about it, that implies a lot of different roles out there that like influence how the president behaves and acts. And yeah, you can probably just get like 2 or 3 iterations away before you see something that you can skill up in and move towards and be a part of, you know, something larger, right? Another thing about EA that I'm sure Rocky talks about is community, right? It's like, there's a lot of people who are trying to think about these problems, who are going to arrive at a bunch of similar problems to you, who can all be a part of like this like big ever-changing apparatus that is like our whole society and our whole economy and our whole political system. And there's a place where you fit in and you do what you can do. And the whole point of the exercise is to find that place. And I think this part is where you say like, okay, like who's got their like, you know, hand on the button? Who's really going to like do the last mile thing, right? And what is that person relying on? And how does that person come to be in a position where they're doing the right thing? And what other people are doing work that influences that? Yeah, and I think like this why aren't they fixing it thing, is it values, is it missing skills? Yeah, so I think about politics a lot. I think about people who go off to DC and things like that, and how like, yeah, I think many of them are motivated by this tribal thing. You grew up in a Republican family, you grew up in a Democratic family, you just like want your party to win. So you go out there and you like, you know, lick your finger and say like, you know, what's popular these days? What is my party like? What do people vote for? What are people excited about? Let me go and do that. This is like probably too cynical of a view of people in politics. But I do think there's like some truth to it, that if you try really, really hard to counteract, you might start behaving a little differently than a lot of people in DC. And again, like finding a role that exercises your skills and like leverages your community and what you know. You know, you might be surprised at like, you know, how much can change, you know, when people work together towards a common goal that they've thought really carefully about. Great. And then this leads me to part of the more standard 80K advice, where there's like, here are like 4 big levers on the world that we think are like neglected and are good frames for thinking about your career. I guess the thing that I want to emphasize is that like, you shouldn't necessarily think about a career as like just one of these. It will probably be primarily one of these, but it will like have some aspects and combinations with the others. So like earning to give is like this very classic popular EA idea where it's like, yeah, what most people in the world think about you and your skills is like, oh, how can this person help me make money? What will I pay them to do for me? And so in some sense, like figuring out what the highest earning job that you can get is like taking some information from the rest of the world and what they think you are best at. And yeah, there's an interesting podcast from a long time ago in our archive somewhere where our podcast host, Rob Wiblin, like talks to his friend about like why he is the way he is. And his friend just like asked this very novel question, which is like, what if 10% or even 90% or something of the human population were like just totally effective altruists? They were totally into it. They like bought everything 80,000 hours, said, what would they be doing? And I think the answer is like the vast majority of people would be earning to give, right? There's a market out there for your skills. You know, other people want things that you happen to be good at providing, right? You go out and then you spend the surplus on the things that you think matter and need to move on the margin. So like, yeah, in some sense, like when most people do this exercise, the answer they will come to is like some kind of earning to give career. Though, as I said, everything kind of combines with everything else. I think the most famous earning to give figures do roll in a lot of advocacy to what they do. So I think about like Alan Saldana and Matt Waga, who, yeah, are not like super, super popular, but back when earning to give was like a big focus for 80,000 hours, we talked about these guys a lot. And they're like very involved with the community of people giving and the people deciding where their money goes. And I honestly think that even though like these guys were like in finance and gave away $500,000 a year or more, yeah, their influence in just terms of writing and engaging with other people, thinking about earning to give, probably ended up directing a lot more money towards the things they cared about than they did themselves. But they had an enormous amount of credibility, making the sacrifices that they made and doing the jobs that they did. So that's a way that like earning to give and advocacy kind of combine. Research, I think, as a dedicated career is like pretty rare. Because yeah, just like what you hear from professors is something like, yeah, like the top 10% of like research assistants and graduates do 90% of the work. You know, and I think this is sort of consistent with my more speculative model of, yeah, people just like have some burning desire to know more about some particular aspect of the world and they can't help it. And I think you should look around for that. But I don't know, don't be like shocked or dismayed if you don't find it. I certainly didn't find it. That's why I'm not a researcher. I think that's what like most people who explored this question, that's probably the conclusion they reached. So that's okay, but it's worth running through. And I think as you run through this exercise in the course of 30 or 40 hours thinking about the world's problems, you might run in to like that weird subsection of a problem that you want to like go deeper on and no one else has gone as deep as they ought to have. And that might have you land in research where like then your research, the eventual output is like the project, the very concrete thing that other people should be doing. And that's one way to have huge influence, right? Is if you just like have the very concrete practical idea about how we're going to solve this problem for which there's like very good reasons for working on. And the other thing is direct work, which I kind of parse as like implementation and building organizations. Yeah, I guess this is like, yeah, when I think about my own career, it's like somewhere between advocacy and direct work. Right? Because like I'm building this organization. The organization is like based on my values, which are like some kind of effective altruism values, right? That are like broadly shared by 80K. And I don't know if I sound like an advocate right now, but like I believe these things. I want other people to consider them carefully. And like that's to me just like good advocacy is like asking the right questions, like asking people to take their time and come to their own conclusions about things. But you know, I'm also like helping this organization grow and build and put out its products that I think are like broadly really valuable for the world, even if they're not my exact like one-on-one advising project. And the people who run our operations and budgeting and all that, like, are also helping. And they're like, yeah, I think especially motivated and add a lot to like our culture and the broader EA community and things, just like through being a little closer to it and having like good lunchtime conversations, even though in principle, I'm not sure like their values like matter a ton for what they do. Like we could have just hired anyone else. And if they were like really good at running operations or doing a budget, like they do nice work for us and they'd be a nice colleague, even though they thought what we were doing is like weird or wrong for whatever reasons they might have. But I do think there's like, some extra benefit to that. And like, you can do some careful calculation where you try to decide what's the value of this operations work that someone else could be doing. Like, why is me doing it? Like, especially valuable. And I think those lunchtime conversations and adding to the community and the advocacy on the side, it's a platform for credibility and it does matter. So think about which of these 4 things like you're going to fit into at this stage when you've already probably done 100 hours of thinking and conversations. And how they might combine in your case. And then I think work backwards is again, like now you're thinking more about, you've thought about which roles, the kind of chain of roles that like go up to the role that you think you'll have at your peak career to like influence your theory of change in the world. And then think about the stuff you need. Do you need a special degree for this role? Do you need some certain kind of experience? Where does that experience start? Can it be like volunteer experience? What kind of people should you know? What kind of people who do these kind of roles, what kind of people do they know? And then like, what kind of spending can help you do better? I think a lot of like very generic advice that comes out of EA is like value your time. If you have money to value your time at like some higher rate, most people just tend to think like, again, the conventional thing is like, my career is about earning more money. And therefore I should do whatever I can to save money. And oftentimes people are like implicitly valuing an hour of their time at like $4 or $5 an hour. And like, there's a minimum wage. Right? Like you should be off earning that minimum wage instead of like trying to save like, like $5 by like taking 6 buses instead of an Uber or something like that. $5 an hour or like whatever the time equivalent would be. I guess people do this with planes a lot. There are like probably other examples you can think of. And that's just one small example of like how you think about money to help you focus on what you think is really important in building the skills that you need. And then like, I guess the process I'm going to talk about next is like a little bit like what we call the ladder of cheap tests. So like once you've decided like this broad path that you think is going to be valuable, take the first few steps and be like super willing to quit and falsify your whole hypothesis that you spent all this time building. Because you probably came up with some other hypotheses that are like kind of close or like good neighbors to this. So like the first couple steps you should do is like read a book, talk to someone who's done this, set up some kind of like test situation for yourself. Like you can do this with a friend as well to like create some accountability. And then maybe you apply for a role or do an internship or volunteer or something. And at any point, this can start to feel like a really bad idea or like its value above what you thought was the second best kind of like path of roles that you should do falls below that. And then just like be very willing to drop it. I think also some generic advice that we disagree with out there is like, persevere, stick through everything, fight. I think that once you start testing and you're getting really bad feedback, it's still early in this process for you. So you should just feel very free to be like, all right, well, let's do the cheap and early parts of some other thing before we like go back to this thing that's looking increasingly hard or unpromising. So like the advice here is like, is really to like do some small tests, don't overcommit, quit, change, explore more, because as much as like talking and thinking about theory, which is all I've done here, I realize, is good, it doesn't give you the final answer. And it really is a poor substitute for real experience that you can get in relatively small and low commitment ways. Graduate school is the thing that I talk to people a lot about. And there are a lot of things you should do before you commit to graduate school that I did not do before I committed to graduate school, for example. I realized I didn't do any biography here, but I was a lawyer for 3 years. I went to 3 years of law school and then practiced law for 3 years. I don't do that now, I do this. And I did not think about it very much at all. I just thought like, here's something I can do. And I got on the track and didn't look back or consider other things until, I was already 6 years of my life, like kind of in the hole. So a lot of good advice comes in the shape of don't be like me. In that respect, don't be like me. Great. And so then quick review, these are the steps: clarify values, pick a problem, target a role, and work backwards. That's my slide and that's my talk. There's my email. there's where you can apply to speak to our team, which I encourage lots of people to do. So thank you all. I probably went on a bit longer than I hoped I would. Sometimes I can't help myself, but now I hope you've come up with some questions. The floor is open. I'd love to chat.